Monitors? Yeah? It reads how great cities are fed. Okay, good evening. My name is Pierre Bélanger. I'm a landscape architect from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. I recognize that there's three challenges this evening. First of all, it's a Saturday night, and I'm sure many of you have incredibly wonderful things to be doing, and so it's really nice to have you here. Also, I realize that there's a basketball challenge right behind the curtain, so I thank you for being here as well. And then third, also, I'm not an expert on food systems in Moscow. So I hope you'll allow me to engage in a thought experiment that deals with an understanding of the relationship between food, markets, economies, and urbanism. I'm also going to try to make the case within the next, we'll be together for the next 45 minutes, is to try to understand how we could potentially make the case for a pattern of suburbanization that's potentially required in Moscow in relationship to the future. So I'm just going to start off with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to speak about a little known fact about the relationship between the globalization of the food chain. I'm going to speak about the cold chain, which is the most important infrastructure that underlies urban life today. I'll speak about food as a weapon, and then we'll try to make this conclusion about suburbanization as a potential path forward for the people here at the Moscow Urban Forum. Let me start with a small anecdote. I've always wondered where food comes from. I find it particularly interesting that when you ask people where food comes from, so for example, the kiwi fruits that you have been indulging with over the past few days, that they are politically charged with the political embargo that Russia has been imposing on European sanctions to Russia. It's interesting that those kiwi fruits cost about 25 rubles. They come from Iran, and they also have to travel certain distances to get here. They're not cheap, they're not local, they're completely global, but I would argue that they're not urban at all. It's part of an industrialized food chain. How do we understand that food chain is very difficult, or at the same time can be seen as being very easy. If you take a look at any fruit, you see this little sticker on it. Most people don't really pay attention much to it, but when you pay really close attention to the little Miss Chiquita, and you follow the flow of where bananas come from, for example, you can look at the price lookup code, the PLU, and you can literally map the entire food system in the world. And what's interesting is that once you start to add up those stupid little stickers, they start to paint a kind of map of the world. This is the fruit that comes from Latin America, and then all of a sudden you can begin to see that those little stickers actually make both a beautiful and extremely frightening map of the world. Essentially, you can get bananas in Russia, in America, all year long. And so it's interesting to be able to understand how there's a kind of flattening of the seasons of production thanks to globalization. But how, in fact, does this work? How does it operate? It no longer deals with this interrelationship between farmers in rural areas and metropolitan centers that have historically defined cities themselves, but rather they deal with an entirely new structure. It's a structure of decentralization for which we need to understand the logistics and the terminals and the markets that are involved in the system. That's why, as a result of that, we have about 78 different varieties of apple around the world, and we can essentially chart the different varieties of them. But what I find particularly interesting is that this question about how great cities are fed is a question that's actually really close to home. This kind of incredible manifesto by Peter Kropotkin, The Conquest of Bread, where he asks by what means could a city in a state of revolution be supplied with food? This is an incredible question to be asking because we are in that revolutionary moment now. not just 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So what I thought I'd do is I dug up a book that's not very well known. It was written in 1929 by Walter P. Hayden. He was the head of commerce of the Port of New York and New Jersey. The book is called How Great Cities Are Fed. It's a very difficult book to find, but there's two things that define this book. He speaks about the logistical transformation as a result of the invention of refrigeration. And I would argue that the reason why you can be sitting down now and not foraging for food or not hunting is because of refrigeration. And refrigeration is so poorly known as part of an urban infrastructure that there is actually no book on the relationship between refrigeration and urbanization in the 21st century, let alone an understanding of what the cold chain is. Walter P. Hayden also speaks about the concept of the food shed. And the idea of understanding food as a shed, of mapping it as a shed, is really useful for us to understand where food comes from. Hayden speaks about, first of all, you can all hear me well, hopefully, yeah. Walter Hayden, when he wrote the book in 1929, spoke about the revolutionary boxcar, the refrigerated boxcar, the transportation of ice, the insulation of ice inside of trains, to be able to transport goods, and you can begin to understand that the historic relationship between farming and cities all of a sudden essentially grew, right? What's really nice and what's important to kind of understand is that still with the ice economy, there was still a kind of relationship with land as part of market economies of food distribution. This connection between food and land is extremely important because, as I started off in the conversation, we have absolutely no idea where our food comes from. Most of you don't come from farming families. You're probably removed 2 or 3 or 4 families already, and that's what we supposedly called being urban, being so removed from the food that you have no idea where it comes from. What I like about the relationship of ice as a kind of preservation mechanism is that it allows us to understand, in fact, the territories that supported the infrastructure of food distribution. This is the only claim to fame that Cambridge, Massachusetts has. This is the global ice industry from Fesh Pond, where ice from Cambridge was essentially distributed around the world, to the tropics, and also all the way to the Mediterranean. As a result of this ice trade, there was then a series of few inventions. Boxcars, tropical colonization that was enabled through the distribution and preservation of food in the tropics, but then also allowed for the distribution and preservation of food back to the Americas and the temperate industrial world. The refrigerator at a domestic level, and then also at the same time, more recently, the synthesization of refrigeration through hydrofluorocarbons allowed us to invent the refrigerated container. So while a lot of people speak about global maritime shipping and containers as supporting global economies, it is in fact the refrigerated boxcar that actually supports the global economy. So important is that, that not only does it so-called support modern life, but this cold chain, the distribution of food to be able to preserve it during a number of weeks, and its distribution through market terminals in order to get to cities, and then to get to your home, and then to get into your fridge. This entire cold chain also contributes to 25% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. There's another little invention that's kind of important to this, is the invention of frozen food and frozen food packaging by Clarence Birdseye. He actually stole the idea from the Eskimos in Labrador in the early 20th century, where he saw that Eskimos were using ice and snow as a preservation mechanism. All the way to today, that Clarence Birdseye has formed the largest frozen food corporation in the world, where literally the idea of frozen fresh food is our understanding of fresh food. Now think about it for a minute. This idea and irony of frozen fresh food. So what's interesting is this cold chain is actually quite sophisticated. It ranges in temperatures between minus 30 in terms of deep freeze, minus 30 degrees Celsius, all the way to frozen food, which is at minus 20, usually that you have in your freezer at home, all the way to what's called the banana temperature, in order to preserve the lifespan of bananas themselves. You'll notice in this kind of second half of the diagram, this chill temperature is 2 to 5 degrees in your refrigerator. It's approximately the same temperature of the ocean in coasts where most of the marine habitat allows fish to breed. There's a kind of really nice relationship to the fact that the temperature in your refrigerator is the temperature of the ocean. Walter P. Hayden, in addition to talking about the cold chain, introduced this idea of mapping where food comes from, specifically by drawing these maps of the transportation infrastructure of rail and dairy farms around cities to be able to understand where, in fact, it came from. It completely defied the idea of the kind of city as a contained territory. As a result of course, in the US, the development of transportation systems, all of a sudden, a much larger network of interconnectivity and interregionalism between cities became extremely important for the distribution of food. The transportation highways could be seen then as these kind of like rivers of distribution of food. What's interesting to note is that before the formation of a Department of Transportation in the US, roads, highways, routes were actually under the Department of Agriculture. Interesting how the idea that an agricultural department would be regulating the state of the roads. Also keep in mind that even previous to this, roads themselves were private and they were maintained by farmers. You can begin to understand that I'm trying to speak about the idea of suburbanization and decentralization, where the role of the state also can work hand in hand with enterprise. So let's take a look specifically, just in terms of understanding how the cold chain and also at the same time the food shed allows us to kind of like remap and understand this third infrastructure that's being created today throughout the world over the past half century. It's the infrastructure of food market terminals. There are a series of large ones across the world. I'm going to speak about the third largest one in America. It's the Ontario Food Terminal. It single-handedly, as a terminal, explains how you can get food to a city of 5 million people. As I understand it, Moscow does not have such a wholesale food terminal, yet it's contemplating the construction of them. So this is a kind of model. I just want you to remember the little sticker of the Chiquita banana because all the images I'm showing you are of this terminal that's never been mapped, it's never been written about, and I simply discovered for myself how this place works. It's kind of like a large terminal with large trucks, and then you see the names of these families, companies along this building. There's 12 families that essentially control this entire terminal. I'm going to take you through a series of images, just to be able to explain how it works. It's essentially this U-shaped building that was built between 1951 and 1954 by a quasi-governmental agency, but also hand in hand with a group of farmers. The reason why it was constructed is because of two things. I want you to forget the romanticism of buying local, simply because of the fact that if you go back 100 years, you begin to understand that essentially consumers had absolutely no control over the quality of the food. So all of a sudden, varying levels of quality of food, poor foods were essentially being sold without controls, without regulation. And essentially in a post-war building boom, there was a need for essentially regulation and also at the same time, price controls. You'll have to appreciate here, Toronto, unlike any other major city in North America, is a place where you can walk on every street corner and walk into any convenience store and buy a banana or an apple for 25 cents. So that's approximately 50 rubles. It's an incredible kind of system that works as a result of this terminal, which is kind of like a stock exchange for food. It was once originally connected by rail, but essentially 20 years later, food transportation by truck and by refrigerated boxcar took over. The reason for its invention also had to do with the burning down of the traditional market in the center of the city, and also at the same time, the logistics of truck transportation essentially was taking over. Hamburg in Germany then copied the model from Toronto and then built their own market terminal here, which is one of the largest ones in Europe. Please note that it's not the opposite way around. The Germans took from the Canadians. I also want to mention that it was a project with the state and entrepreneurs. To a certain extent, they were kind of seen as being the food mafia of Toronto, but nevertheless, they got this built. But what was particularly interesting is that within a period of 10 years, they had essentially outgrown the size of the terminal. It was working so well, where essentially all the farmers would come in, they would then supply the market with a range of different fruits and vegetables that would grow in diversity, then equalize the price, and then distribute to retail customers and wholesale customers throughout the city. Restaurants, small stores, large supermarkets. This was all outdoors, and then all of a sudden it became much larger. As I mentioned, 10 years after it surpassed its size, so they had to expand. And this just gives you a kind of regional context of where it was, just on the side of the railway. But now today, the railway is actually outpassed by truck transportation. These are photos just taken a couple of years ago that I took around the terminal. And essentially, the terminal opens at 3 o'clock in the morning and finishes its business at around 10 a.m. So essentially, it's operating 365 days a year, 7 days a week. And essentially, trucks are lining up at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning to be able to bring their goods in and also bring their goods out. It's a place of total circulation. Ironically, the default color of everything is white. Trucks, transport trucks, reefers. It operates like a mini city. It has its own police, its own gates. Also to the point that now it has to expand underneath the parking garage. So this is another farmer's market that is expanded. They bring in their goods on a daily basis, and essentially they sell practically everything every day. And everything's entirely recycled. Even their waste goes back to farms to be used as treated fertilizer. Now what's particularly important, and I'm going to start to zoom out from the actual infrastructure and architecture of the terminal to start to understand how it actually supports and interconnects with a much larger region of production. You see, one thing that Canada has in relationship to Russia is global climate change. Essentially, you are a winner. It's a win-win situation for Canada and Russia as the planet warms because your growing seasons will continue to expand. This is Leamington, Kingsville in Canada off the shores of Lake Erie. It's the largest, it's called the tomato capital of Canada, and it has more greenhouse startups than the region of cultivation in California, believe it or not. This is approximately 100 kilometers away from the food terminal. As I mentioned before, on every street corner of Toronto, you're able to essentially purchase fruits and vegetables for a remarkably low cost. For anybody who's ever visited the US, it's a fundamentally different situation, which is filled with food deserts. These kind of a small Asian and series of multinational and multicultural convenience stores at the top, the Asian farm, are found practically everywhere in Toronto. And essentially what they're doing is allowing small entrepreneurs to compete against these large big box outlets like Walmart. As I mentioned before, the proliferation of greenhouse startups is also enabled by the presence of the food terminal. And also at the same time, for the City of Toronto, in relationship to conversations that you've been having over the past few days regarding industry and technology, the largest manufacturing industry in area in Toronto is essentially food processing and food packaging and food remanufacturing. And these are just a series of enterprises associated with it. So at the middle of the Ontario Food Terminal are essentially these cultivation regions that are essentially enabled and supported by the terminal itself amidst, of course, a strong cultivation region. This is not actually unlike Moscow itself, that is endowed with a number of different cultivation regions around it. Going back to the map of highways across North America, the Ontario Food Terminal, OFT, is in the middle of essentially these rivers of distribution from California, from Mexico, from Florida, from the West Coast, also that receives a number of fruits and vegetables year-long to ensure for a city of 5 and expanding to a city of 6 to 7 million is ensured supply on a year-round basis. Now, you'll begin to understand that in relationship to the map of global temperatures, that all of a sudden, you can see how the Ontario Food Terminal finds itself at the center of both global climate change and changing temperatures, and what it does is capitalizes on those different temperatures. So, of course, the red is the hotter temperatures, the tropical latitudes, and I'll just put in relationship the food terminal. This is essentially the extent and the reach of the food terminal, where it also then receives goods by air. Now, I want to make sure that I'm not frightening anyone, because I want to make it clear that as I reach the half point of the presentation, is that there are limits to this system. I want you to be able to understand that the furthest distance that we take, and the further the infrastructure and the territorial reach for fruits and vegetables and food commodities that are allowed by refrigeration, then puts into question how then do we potentially make stronger connections regionally? How do we make more regional connections to land around cities? Keep in mind, it would be nice in the future if your children had a slightly better idea of where food comes from, let alone trying to have an understanding of potentially producing their own food as well. And so this map of understanding how we can flatten the global food chain by essentially distributing from around the world is important to understand from a temporal perspective. Time plays an extremely important part of this global map, even though it seems really flat. So I'm going to make a small kind of like interlude before I finish off with a kind of case about market economies in a part of the world that has no refrigeration. Chances are it's probably a part of the world that frightens many people because every time that you speak about a slum, every time you speak about a place in development or an emerging economy, keep in mind, I want you to put those eyes on with this idea of the global cold chain and to understand that most of those places, whether or not we're talking about Lagos in Nigeria, Port-au-Prince in Haiti, or Mumbai in India, it is urbanism without refrigeration. So normally, if I would have a little bit more time, I would ask the following question. What do you think urbanism without refrigeration looks like? Do I have time to ask this question? Are we halfway? We're past halfway? Not yet. Okay, so we have time to do this. Let's pose the question. I'd like to see how smart you are. What does urbanism without refrigeration look like? And I want you to imagine your life without your fridge, without the refrigerated boxcars and containers that got the nice kiwis, the strawberries and blueberries to your table tonight, or the food that got delivered to the restaurant that you're going to go party in tonight. What do you think urbanism without refrigeration looks like? Anybody? Yes. Ah, we have a mic. It's nice to be able to be interactive in this really large space. I think our tech guys are going to fix that. Ah, nice.
Okay, dried and fresh.
Sorry?
Dried and fresh. Dry and fresh what?
Maybe it's like a dry and fresh urbanization, I don't know.
Okay. You sound almost like an architect. And if in the case that you are, can you be a little bit more specific about the forms of urbanism that you would find? Assuming that you're an architect?
Yeah, wait.
But anybody else could essentially answer the question. This is a really good starting point.
Okay, I guess there would be markets like in every corner of the street and every plaza in the city.
I love it. The city as a continuous market. So, if you put together this idea of fresh and dry food, or dry and wet markets, all of a sudden, you begin to understand the form, the configuration of cities, of economies that don't have this refrigerated infrastructure. They all of a sudden start to make sense, right? Now, it's interesting because all of a sudden, we can start to then potentially ask the next question, and I think because of time, I'll try to answer these questions, and maybe we can probe a little bit deeper afterwards, is essentially the factor of time. If you have fresh and dry food on a constant basis, that constant basis is every day. So the kind of action of the market economies, the actions of the individual entrepreneur, are essentially start in the same way that the terminal does at the Ontario Food Terminal. They essentially start at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning from markets, and they make their way all the way to the city. They have to form around kind of junctions and nodes, and they have to be distributed. But it's an indirect connection. And it's something that we don't know very much about in terms of this relationship of distribution and the logistics that are involved as part of urbanization. So I want to be able to kind of like just speak about a few things before getting into an example of a market economy where urbanism operates and actually functions incredibly well, better than we might think without refrigeration. I think it's key to understand food as a commodity index today. At the moment, we're seeing a level, I want to talk about 2 or 3 processes that are happening globally, and also at the same time, a relationship of you can understand how you might be able to influence the level of knowledge that we do not have about these processes through a couple of examples. The global land grab. What we're seeing right now, movements of countries that have no productive capacity through their lands are now buying land in other countries that have a lot of fertile lands. Africa being probably, Africa going through a 3rd round of colonization called the global land grab, where foreign countries are buying up large parcels of land for the production of food. So whereas historically countries have purchased food directly from those countries, they essentially bypass the state, purchase property in those countries, set up the production, the logistics, and essentially distribute back to their own country. What's particularly interesting as part of the global land grab is that it starts to sort of put into question this idea of food scarcity. In fact, it sort of puts the idea of resource scarcity away altogether. In fact, one can argue that we'll never run out of food, nor will we, and I'm going to make this claim, we will never run out of resources ever. In fact, the global problem of food production is one of distribution, not of production. Unevenly distributed around the world. What's important to understand is that our notion about free food resource scarcity is almost 300 or 400 years old, inherited, for example, from Thomas Malthus with his essay on the principle of population, where population one day would outpace the resources that we would have on the planet. It simply is not true. We will never run out of food, ever. The funny thing is that the Club of Rome, some of you may know the work that they do in Geneva. They wrote this great book, The Limits to Growth, in 1972, that then recycled this Malthusian principle of essentially of catastrophe, of population outpacing food resources. But this time it was a little bit more sophisticated with the quote, the Earth's interlocking resources, the global system of nature in which we all live, probably cannot support present rates of growth much beyond the year 2100, if that long, even with advanced technology. So funny to this, they have a diagram that demonstrated and modeled the pace of growth and development between 1900 and 2100 over 200 years. And according to their model, we would essentially we would all be at war. We'd be close to near catastrophe and death and running out of resources, for which we are not. You can see right in the middle, 2014, it's the point at which we would be running completely out of resources, and essentially world pollution would be completely out of control, which is not the case. Now, I'm being careful. I'm not advocating for pollution, and I'm not advocating for unlimited growth. In fact, the very opposite. What we got wrong is the fact that world population did not only continue to essentially concentrate in cities. In fact, what we're seeing around the world is the decentralization of cities, and in fact, world density is going down. So for as much as there's discussion about large cities forming themselves, the density of the world is flattening. Most patterns that are occurring today are patterns of suburbanization. This is what they got wrong. Second, preeminent ecologist Howard Odum essentially predicted also in relationship to carrying capacity of the planet that in fact we should perhaps rethink the whole notion of carrying capacity. He predicted that the carrying capacity of the world, depending on how you calculate it, could be something around the 14 billion or 140 billion for the next century. Can you possibly imagine a world of 140 billion people? There's a great text, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up, just because I'm not making this up. There's a great book called Environment, Power, and Society that would be useful to take a look at. Essentially, Howard Odum's kind of idea from observed processes of both urbanization and ecological development. He was an expert on open ecological systems, and he had this premise on observation that over time, systems, ecologies, societies essentially evolved, innovated, and through ingenuity could continuously address the problems in which they were found. And so to the issue of decentralization of urbanization, potentially one of the most important issues to address is the centralization of the distribution of food around cities and different states. This is a map of the growth of Walmarts across the US over the past half century. Is there Walmarts here? I don't think so. The large big box stores? There isn't. Do you know what I'm talking about when I speak about Walmart? There must be a kind of a Russian equivalent of very large big box stores that are taking over, and they become larger and larger and larger, and at the same time provide a lot of competition for small entrepreneurs. This can be potentially dangerous the more that this company centralizes. To the point that when Walmart essentially grows in size, there's also pushback from the producers because the larger companies like Walmart become, the more they undercut and sell much cheaper food prices and demand lower food prices from farmers. This is just one indication of a protest in front of the Parliament of Canada, which was victim also of lower food prices. And what's interesting is that all of a sudden we begin to see that food itself in contemporary urban economies is a bit of a weapon. And it's not unlike essentially the sort of warning that Lenin provided almost exactly a century ago. The separation of industry from agriculture, the separation of food and land, the separation of territory and essentially inhabitants is preceded by the formation of the agricultural entrepreneur and trade relations. At other poles of the countryside, the separation of industry from agriculture consists in the fact that the poor peasants are being ruined and turned into industrial wage workers. In fact, let me extend Lenin by saying that they're being extended into industrial wage earners who are more and more removed from the means of production. So, the notion of food as a weapon is essentially found in a lot of different places around the world, and there's a kind of like strong history from today in terms of the work of the United States in Afghanistan in terms of trying to import milk and trying to mechanize the dairy chain in the country. And you can go back through the kind of like history of agronomic power and agricultural power to understand how we've been doing this for a very, very long time. My point to this, I'm going to make two juxtapositions. You do it here in Russia, and we do it in America. Everyone does it. We just have not written the book on understanding how food itself has become the new nuclear weapon. And the way to essentially avoid, the way to essentially subvert this as a kind of individual, I think we have to be able to put into question the regionalism of food production in relationship to patterns of urbanization. We have to consider food production as the way in which we grow cities. And I'm going to try to finish off with a kind of a discussion of that. But it's actually fairly interesting to understand that most of the fruit that you're actually receiving, it doesn't come from the EU at all as a result of this embargo that was recently enacted. But also at the same time, the weaponization of food comes in different forms. This is an aerial photograph of a region called the Imperial Valley. It's in between the United States and Mexico. So the bright red is, as you can probably guess, is the US. High fertile agricultural lands. And on the south side is dried out, lower density agricultural lands on the Mexico side. The reason why that is because across the borderline, there's a very sharp line between the red and the gray. There's a canal, and that canal diverts the water from the Colorado River and diverts it north back into the US, away from Mexico. And the irony is essentially then Mexico is left dry, and at the same time, Americans import Mexicans to essentially do all the hard labor in the Imperial Valley region. Again, it's a form of agricultural apartheid. So to turn this around, I think it's useful to understand that there's a few people that have spoken about this before. I keep on making references to some Russian thinkers, philosophers, and economists. There's one preeminent social economist in the US who is actually Canadian. He came from this small farm region in Ontario where the food terminal is from. He wrote this preeminent book, The New Industrial State, in which he talked about in the last century, capital and power became more important than land. It's the same idea that all of a sudden the separation between industry and agriculture was a strategy to impoverish people. And so when he speaks about power and poverty, it's important to understand that how we can perhaps see how we can change that. And this is the turning point in the presentation to understand maybe a really important question we need to ask is, what supports urban life? Beginning by asking simple questions such as, where does the fresh water come from? I was surprised yesterday that practically no one knew who Sergei Zuk was, who was the preeminent hydrological engineer that constructed most of the canals and most of the water systems that actually deliver water to the city and also at the same time prevent the city from flooding. Well, in this case, I think it'd be useful for us, for all of us, to start asking questions about where things come from. And I got 5 kind of different things that we can sort of like think about. Waste, water, food, energy, and transportation. Where do things come from? It's a simple question that essentially can put us to work immediately. Because before we start asking how to change things, I think we need to understand how they work. And I'm absolutely convinced that in the 21st century, with generations that are further removed from means of production, that we have absolutely no idea what we're intervening on. And so I would argue that in order to start that, we need to look at examples. This is a great book by Kristen Medernsna. She's a young Dutch artist and designer. She wrote a book at a 1-to-1 scale on all the products of a pig, this pig 05049. It was her undergraduate thesis project. She didn't have to do a PhD to do this. She didn't even have to go to graduate school. As part of her undergraduate thesis, she essentially mapped all the different parts of a pig and how it's used. She mapped approximately 750 of them inside of this book, from the skin all the way to the derivative products that go to coating Christmas cakes to bullets. beginning to understand where shit goes, because you can't talk about food without waste, realizing that it's only up until 4 years ago that we actually started to map and develop an atlas of shit. It's called the Global Atlas of Excreta by the United Nations, which is simply trying to understand that if we are going to invite and promote more production around cities, around urban economies, we need a simple thing: fertilizer. And it's not synthetic fertilizer that's going to get us back to work. It's actually organic fertilizer. And finally, understanding the global network of terminals around the world, and understanding that there is a global food chain and a global cold chain that supports cities around the world. This is the Marché Rungis in Paris that essentially was constructed over a period of 30 years. And for those of you who might not think that this is important, let me make a relationship. There's a kind of, there's a large process of decentralization in Paris that has been occurring over the past 3 decades, and also at the same time, you can say over the past 7 centuries, that puts into play spaces, parks, plazas in central cities, and food systems. Normally, when I would have a little bit more time, I would ask the question, I usually ask the question to students of architecture, urbanism, planning, about 2 of the most important design competitions in the world over the past 2 decades. One is for le Parc de la Villette in Paris, and the other one is for le Forum Les Halles. I've asked this question around the world to people, to ask them, what are the processes of change that enabled these design competitions to take place? And also at the same time, what were the land uses that supported those sites before they changed into public spaces? And I can tell you how difficult it is to get an answer to this. And it's unfortunate because le Forum Les Halles in Paris has essentially been the central wholesale market of Paris for 7 centuries. Parc de la Villette was a former meat market. So it's interesting to designers that are in the room, maybe planners, maybe even politicians that are in charge of these spaces and these infrastructures, is essentially to also answer and start to address the question of where do these infrastructures go? And in this case, the Marché International de Rungis, the international market of Rungis, was essentially created, it's the one in the lower right corner, was created as a result of the transformation of these other spaces of the Parc de la Villette and the Forum Les Halles. I would suggest that anybody who's interested in this, there's a great book by Émile Zola, In the Belly of Paris, Le Ventre de Paris. So the last example I'd like to give before I sort of make a proposition for Moscow is to try to understand this very notion of market economies through food as a living infrastructure itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an example, perhaps very counterintuitive, and I know maybe this is a very tenuous example of understanding market systems in Haiti. I'm going to try to show a series of indices that demonstrate that for as much as the world thinks that it is the poorest, the most corrupt, and the most difficult country in the world, in fact, I would argue that it has the most robust food system in the world. This is a photograph of essentially a wholesale food production in the higher mountains of Haiti. For those who might not know, Haiti is an island in the middle of the tropics shared with Dominican Republic. It has no logistical cold chain. It has no refrigeration except for this one, which is essentially blocks of ice that are produced in 3 locations in the country. And those blocks of ice are constantly maintained, for example, in this case, in the top left corner, with the waste of rice husks in order to make sure that they can preserve food in markets. What's interesting is that, as some of you may know, Haiti is always under threat of major floods from tropical storms throughout the year. And there's a remarkable level of kind of like ingenuity in terms of protecting people from those floods, whether or not it's temporarily relocating on top of a small bridge or on top of a roof. And this level of ingenuity, in fact, translates itself to a number of different scales. One of the things that most people don't understand is that Haitians have a form of live infrastructure in the form of animals. About 30 years ago, everyone across the country owned a pig. It was essentially like a mobile bank. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, eradicated all 800,000 of the Creole pigs that existed in Haiti by fear of a fever that was spreading across the tropical islands. It was essentially their living bank. So imagine when their kids went to school in September, at the end of the harvest season, they would give a pig and it would pay for tuition, it would pay for school, it would pay for uniforms. It's kind of like live money. Of course, the Americans came in with these pink pigs from Idaho. Of course, they never really managed to take off because they're in the tropics and they can't stand the heat. It's a failure to understand tropical conditions. Failure to understand live infrastructure. But here's a map that I think is an image that I think is particularly important. All of you know that there was a serious earthquake in 2010 that killed approximately 100,000 people and displaced over 2 million. All of you are aware of this earthquake, I hope? Okay. What's particularly interesting, the map that you're looking at in the center is the completely destroyed central market of Port-au-Prince, the central capital. And you see the blue and the white tents in the middle of the streets? Those are tents of markets. Can you see those? In between the large building blocks? These are the market stalls. This picture was taken 6 months after the earthquake, but reports say that 2 days after the earthquake, the market came back immediately. What does that tell us? That tells us for all the foreign aid that came in, the one thing that was able to get things to bounce back and the economy to flow, because essentially when economies are destroyed, people need access to two things: cash, food. The market allows that to happen. Now what's particularly interesting is that this photograph allows us to ask the question, where was the food coming from? It comes back to our original question, what supports life here? Well, it becomes really interesting because all of a sudden it leads us towards understanding and mapping food market systems. But for anybody who knows the region will realize that's an extremely difficult thing to do because Haiti's been under a series of revolving military dictatorships over the past 5 decades. And there's essentially 50 years of knowledge about markets and rural farming systems that's absent. So the only way to learn about it is to go yourself and find out. So that's what we did. I'm just showing a few pictures from a project that we did, and I'll explain just who was involved. But let me cycle through this fairly quickly so that you can get the point. Everybody thinks the following. Haiti is a country that's a victim of prejudice that we hold against it: dangerous, corrupt, destitute. Like many other countries that cannot survive under corruption, where a lot of the foreign aid never got itself to the ground, you can't help to ask how people were supporting themselves. So let me show you something really interesting, and I don't want to kind of bore you with numbers, but these numbers are particularly important. And then what I'll do, I'll spatialize what these numbers represent. I put Russia in the Russian Federation in context here, just so that you know. But these are a series of indices to show how we got things wrong and how food and market systems allow us to change the way in which we understand urban economies. So this is the Global Competitiveness Report. They have approximately 50 different indicators of economic strength. Quality of overall infrastructure. Out of 144 countries, Haiti's at the bottom. The US, of course, is 25. Russia, in large part, with all these indices, is always in the middle. My point is really about how, through the indicators, interestingly enough, Haiti all of a sudden changes. So watch this. Quality of roads. US, of course, number 20, 140 for Haiti. Really bad roads. Quality of transport infrastructure. US at 30, 144 for Haiti, at the very bottom. Again, quality of electrical supply, 33 for the US, and Haiti's at the very bottom, 139. Distribution of public funds, as you can begin to see, the US is at number 34. Haiti's still at the bottom, 137. This is where it changes. Wastefulness of government spending, 76 for the US. Ironically, Russia stays right in the middle again. Haiti is at 140. This is where it dramatically changes. Female participation in labor force. Haiti becomes number 40, and US goes down to number 44. Russia, 39. Interesting. The role of women in labor force all of a sudden outpaces the US. And if you take it even further, flexibility of wage determination. Haiti, number 19. The US drops at 34. Russia's at 69. What this means, high degree of female involvement and actually empowerment in the urban economy, and also at the same time, ability to determine salaries. Now this is really cool because all of a sudden when you start to ask the question, how did the economy in Haiti bounce back after the earthquake? It wasn't as a result of international funds and aid. It was as a result of the regional market of food distribution. And at the center of this was the role of market women. They're known as Madame Sarah. They're these kind of like really strong, robust market women. They're brokers that operate as these kind of middle women from between farmers and cities. But let's not romanticize them. They are very, very tough, and they're constantly undercutting prices. But what they are ensuring is the bridge between getting food from the productive regions of the country all the way down to places of consumption in cities. So what's interesting is that for all the work that the World Bank and, for example, the Ministry of the Department of Civil Protection is doing, these Madame Sarahs, these strong market women, find themselves right in the middle. But try to look up anything about Madame Sarahs and market women, and you'll find nothing over the past 65 years of research. Nothing. Not for nothing that we call it informal, unregulated, non-institutional. Highly robust, highly sustainable. Let me go through a few images just to be able to speak about this is a central production region of Haiti, growing things from essentially 78 different varieties of mangoes to 67 different types of rice. Crops themselves are a form of credit. You have credit cards in the form of plastic in your hands. They have credit in the forms of crops. Live capital in the forms of these wet markets of animals. Extremely sophisticated distribution from regional areas all the way down to central cities. Distribution of regional farms across the island that's shared with the Dominican Republic. It's important because Haiti is the most agriculturally productive country in the Caribbean. Anyways, I'm going to bypass this map just to be able to keep on time here. The failure for us to understand the productivity of Haiti simply has to do with the fact that we've overlooked that as being poor, destitute, and corrupt. Also at the same time because we have absolutely no knowledge of tropical economies. Now, you might not care about that, but I think we should pay attention simply because of the fact that it is an example of urbanism without refrigeration. And in fact, our future is going to be not about increasing levels of refrigeration and increasing levels of infrastructure. I would argue that it's actually lessening and reducing it. There's a form of rural capitalism that's involved. And I'm just going to cycle through a series of strategies that they've been developing. These are just images of markets that are connected with schools, churches, and existing markets in different sites and regions across the country. They operate across the valley. What's interesting is that these essentially these markets, these schools, places that have dormitories for women, essentially operate on a number of different levels. They operate as evacuation spaces during periods of high flood and during hurricanes, during the tropical storm season, and the rest of the year, they essentially operate as these productive market areas. So essentially these areas are built like farms, they work like a market, and they run like a bank. I'm just going to go quickly through these images to speak about all the different elements, from nails to rocks to blocks to wire to stairs, that essentially support those market economies. And I'm showing you these images also to get to my point that it is the infrastructure of plants that also supports them in a very important way, but they are fundamentally unplanned. They're built and constructed and designed by the groups and organizations that are there. And they're responsive to a tropical calendar of production that's extremely intensive. And essentially, there's a sophistication in the knowledge about the botany, the forestry, the silviculture, the agriculture of plants across the country itself. Knowledge for which most people that live in cities have very little of. And I'm going to get to the importance of horticulture and silviculture and forestry in a minute, but where we can understand potentially vegetation, plants as a risk aversion system. In many respects, through the market system and this form of rural capitalism, they've been able to ensure a level of freedom from the risks of storms and hurricanes, even though we don't necessarily associate Haiti as being a free country. But what I find particularly interesting, even looking at some of the most important artwork that comes out of Haiti, there's an understanding of the distribution of market systems rather than the centralization of them. There's less a conversation about cities and urban form that's concentrated than there is one about the distribution across the country. What's interesting is that even though it's a tropical country, this level of utopianism is actually not that far from certain ideas that we can essentially glean from here. Even in the work of Peter Kropotkin, coming back to the text that we quoted at the very beginning, The Conquest of Bread, there's a French geographer who I'm quoting here that wrote a preface. Never was the land so energetically cultivated as in 1792, when the peasant had taken back the soil from the landlord, which they coveted so long. I'm advocating for essentially the distribution and decentralization of land for private ownership. It gets us to the notion and relationship of food and market economies with urbanism. At the moment, those market economies are not in your hands. And I just showed you an extreme example of where a failed state leaves market economies in the hands of their citizens, Haiti. It's a completely extreme example. What we can do, I think, is start to borrow from plans where there's involvement of state and also involvement of urban planning. In the case of Ludwig Hilberseimer, German-American immigrated urban planner who worked with Mies van der Rohe, who was advocating for the distribution and decentralization and opening up of industrial grids and industrial form along natural features such as rivers in this case. The picture on the right, the image on the right shows the decentralization and opening up of form. And all I'm going to do is show a series of examples that we can draw from to begin to understand the relationship of opening up of land for a range of different purposes, including food production, including forestry, including silviculture, including botany, as a way to essentially generate and grow urban economies themselves. Now that's a little bit counterintuitive because most of the time we essentially rely on technology to be able to grow an economy. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, Broadacre City, who advocated with natural features also the distribution of land with different concentrations of housing. It was concentrated on this idea of essentially productivity of land. The work of Andrea Branzi and his work, although utopian, Agronica, the dissolution of the boundaries between agriculture, industry, manufacturing, and living. But even if that seems utopian, this image that seems almost unbelievable of the overlay of energy districts and wind energy on top of potato farms, this is out of the state of Michigan, is actually a reality. Imagined I think what we need to be able to understand is how we can actually open up land and decentralize urban form to make landscapes productive. So I want you to remember this idea of refrigeration that underlies everything and every part of urban fabric and urban form the minute that you walk out of this room. I'm going to finish off with a few images that I think are particularly inspiring because, in fact, these histories that I've drawn from over the past 2 or 3 centuries, and even cases from across the world, are not so far distant. I love this image of 1971 of Muscovites essentially fishing on top of the river. Not necessarily sustaining their livelihoods, but this engagement with essentially food production, animal life, and essentially ecologies. And I want to kind of like pair some of the early thoughts in the 1930s and 1940s in planning in Moscow. And I'm going to sort of, I know this is a very tenuous kind of relationship between the work of 1930s planning in Russia and Abraham Lincoln, but a kind of socialist ideal of the great fine art in the future will be the making of a comfortable life from a small piece of land. But I'm not trying to be romantic about it. In fact, what I find particularly interesting in the planning in Moscow, that there was an extremely productive relationship with the river, an orientation of its grid, an orientation of its streets, an open orientation of its open spaces that made it and allowed us to imagine productivity, that allowed us to imagine food production, that allowed us to imagine manufacturing with these urban areas. Thus learning, and I'm quoting again one last time from Peter Kropotkin in these last 2 final slides, thus learning the art of horticulture from experts and trying experiments and different methods on small patches of soil reserved for the purpose of vying with each other to obtain the best returns, finding in physical exercise without exhaustion or work, the health and strength which so often flags in cities, men, women, and children will gladly turn to the labor of the fields when it is no longer a Slavic drudgery but has become pasture, a festival, a renewal of health and joy. And I'm going to pay your attention to the middle image. This was planning in the 1930s in Moscow that was done by the state. Incredible visions of understanding how we can incorporate public parks, gardens, forests, and nursery gardens, sanitary protection zones, cemeteries, and farmland. Unbelievable, yet we can't possibly even understand that. You couldn't even own a goat or a chicken if you lived in one of those micro districts. All we have to do is remove the regulation to allow you to do what you want. So from there, I'd like to propose, maybe we can begin to understand that plant economies, not just food, and potentially the ecologies of food production, could be seen as a way to understand suburbanization and decentralization as being sustainable. Maybe from there we can also understand that the production of landscape is in fact the pathway for urbanism within the discussion of the forum. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions at all or not?
Maybe 1 minute.
Maybe 1 minute. If there are questions, if not, if not, it's okay. We can go grab a beer or something.
Hey. Hello, thank you for the lecture. I want to ask about last mile of delivery of food. What's the problems and what can be improved with the retailer and how customers act? So people constantly failing at planning what they would eat. I mean, in big cities, a lot of food get bad inside their fridges. So is there some way to innovate or change something? And retailers constantly overbuying food, not to have empty stores.
Right.
Because they don't know what will be bought in the future. They only have statistics.
I'm not sure you're going to like this answer, but I think the answer is more competition. We need the possibility of having more markets, not less. And I'm not coming off as kind of talking about more capitalism. I want to be careful not to come off as saying that. But the way in which they've dealt with the issue more than 60 years ago, 75 years ago in cities like Toronto, in which food was spoiling. Of course, the urban conditions were a little bit different, but still, we had very large concentrations of people in the cities that they were trying to deal with the problem of supply and also at the demand, to try to bring it closer. And the way to do it, in this case, what they did is they developed, of course, this wholesale food terminal. But even if that sounds as a kind of a very large project, and I know that Moscow is now contemplating 2 sites to do this, I think the key right now immediately is to try to understand how more people can open up more little stores and more stands to be able to deliver food to the market. I don't think it's a question of production. I think it's a question of being able to set up a stand on a sidewalk without the police telling you that you have to leave. And I guarantee you, in every city of the world, it's the same thing. If grandmas, old people can set up their little stands with fruits and vegetables because they have the channels, they understand where food can come in from, and essentially everybody wants to be in business. Everybody in the end wants to be their own entrepreneur, that you essentially can allow that. My perspective on it is that we have restrictions in place right now that prevent us from doing that. And I would argue, first, the mapping of rules and restrictions that are, in many respects, causing the issues are really useful to take a look at first and foremost. I don't think it's more regulation and more planning. I think it's less. It's not a very popular answer in some parts of the world.
So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.